Excuse me, crocodoots.
How dare you enter my private inner sanctum without an invitation?
We're surfing the same wavelength, your dudeness, because that's just what I have. Invitations. One for you, and one for you.
And?
That's all they wrote. Later, Gator.
They didn't invite me? Oh, that's so unfair. What's wrong with me? Haven't I always tried to be a good enemy to Donkey Kong?
Among all of the many characters who have made it into the Super Smash Bros. Series as playable, few have had quite as much of an underdog story to get there as King K. Rool. Most characters happen as independent decisions from Masahiro Sakurai himself for one reason or another. But K. Rool is one of an elite few that have managed to get in directly due to fan response. While we all know how K. Rool's story ends, you might not be aware of just how many trials K. Rool faced on his path to get into Smash. This was quite the journey to go through, and a lot of these events are fading into the sands of time when K. Rool finally won and got into the game, since we no longer have to make the case for him anymore. Regardless, K. Rool's quest to get in is what makes him such a special and personal character for so many people, and it's not something that I want to be forgotten. This video is going to go over the full timeline of K. Rool's Smash campaign, as well as those of his competitors. I'm going to show you what the fans were thinking each and every step of the way, and what it meant for K. Rool. So without further ado, let's get into it. There's not much to say about Smash Bros. 64, as the roster for that game was made rather haphazardly. It was originally a game made up to be an original IP before it was decided that inserting Nintendo characters would make more sense. Of note is the fact that on Donkey Kong's profile, one of his 3 game appearances listed as Mario Kart 64, implying that Sakurai thought of DK as a Mario character at the time. This is really just a cliff note and doesn't necessarily mean anything, but Donkey Kong as a franchise was going very strong at that time. All 3 of the original country titles had been released, so this is a small little pet peeve of mine. The 3 big planned characters to be added to Smash 64 were Bowser, King Dedede, and Mewtwo. Bowser and Mewtwo make a lot of sense, though it really shows that even this far back, Sakurai considered his own evil king superior to K. Rool. Or even Ganondorf for that matter, who weren't considered to be in the game at all. I would argue that Donkey Kong and Zelda were significantly bigger than Kirby at the time, so the consideration of Dedede so early in the process was largely just because of Sakurai's personal experience with him. Melee continued, with the Donkey Kong franchise being, for the most part, ignored. Each franchise got only 2 stages, so Donkey Kong was treated as something on par with F-Zero and Mother. Donkey Kong 64 had since come out, and DK was more than big enough to warrant another character. But the big issue that happened was, of course, Rare being bought out by Microsoft. It's been argued many times that Banjo-Kazooie may have been considered for Melee before this buyout, and when that buyout was so recent, Sakurai may not have been sure on the legal state of the Donkey Kong franchise. There is no data within the game to suggest potential characters who were cut, with it being on the record that the next character Sakurai had planned was Wario. K. Rool makes his first cameo appearance in this game as a trophy, a position he'd be staying in for the next several titles. This trophy model doesn't exactly do him a lot of justice, but even all the way back in Melee, they felt the need to acknowledge that K. Rool has a fan base, because he's enough of a bumbler that he's picked up a few fans over the years. K. Rool's Melee trophy has a more specific relevance, though. Looking through the trophies for the Donkey Kong franchise, we have the 3 universal trophies all playable characters get for DK himself, trophies for all of the DK items. Claptrap has a trophy because he appears as a stage hazard, so they can casually port his model over onto the trophy. Now, for the next 4 trophies, these are all characters they specifically went out of their way to make models for just for the trophies, rather than just taking assets from the game. 2 of them are from DK Arcade, Stanley and DK Jr. The only 2 trophies from the Country series are Dixie Kong and K. Rool. This would foreshadow what would become a heated rivalry between these 2 characters in the years to come, as Dixie has always been K. Rool's primary competition for the 3rd Donkey Kong character in Smash. Notice what I said there. The 3rd Donkey Kong character. The supposed 2nd Donkey Kong character, Diddy Kong, is nowhere to be found within Melee. He's not a trophy, he's not anywhere. This strongly suggests that Diddy was considered to be a character in Melee at some point, despite not having been directly name-dropped by Sakurai. Diddy has always arguably been more important than K. Rool to the franchise as the number 2, and if you don't agree with me, that's clearly what Sakurai thinks, since Diddy got put into Brawl over either K. Rool or Dixie. Diddy's omission as a trophy comes across as incredibly odd. I think that if Rare had not been bought out by Microsoft, that the little guy probably would have made it into Melee. Rare being bought out would be horrible news for King K. Rool's prospects in Smash and the DonkeyKong franchise in general. Nobody really acknowledged K. Rool as a Smash candidate until Diddy Kong got in, and he was effectively bottlenecking the progress of the series' representation in Smash by blocking K. Rool and Dixie. While people advocating for K. Rool would exist in Brawl's early life cycle, they would be in considerably smaller numbers early on. The K. Rool train didn't really take off until Diddy Kong was finally confirmed to be in the game. The Brawl speculation era was the true Wild West and where everything truly started. Melee was an event that simply just happened before gaming forums were all that much of a thing, but Brawl was something nerds everywhere were looking forward to. Sakurai would drip-feed content one day at a time on the Smash Bros. Dojo site, slowly revealing information about the game. After the initial trailer revealing 5 newcomers to the game, new characters would just be revealed in updates on Sakurai's blog at complete random at midnight Pacific time. You could tune in each day just to see something like the banana peel or the infamous update telling people that you must recover by using up specials to get back to the stage and not die. Riveting stuff. The hype for Smash Bros. At this time was off the charts, to the point where expectations had been blown ridiculously out of proportion. People would support whatever characters they wanted, to the point that Geno from Super Mario RPG, a character owned by Square Enix from a single Mario game, managed to gather a considerable fan base through some Newsgrounds animations and sprite comic videos that have not aged particularly well. It was an exceedingly different time, with people advocating for characters left, right, and center, regardless of any rhyme or reason. The big thing you need to know is that people's expectations had been set so high by the hype machine that was the Smash Bros. Dojo and Brawl speculation process that people were predicting massive, massive rosters for Brawl. You were laughed at for posting a roster of 35 characters, the amount we get in the final game. The average roster prediction at the time would have at the very, very least 40 characters, if not 45 to 50. After all, Sakurai is just posting these characters at random on the Smash Bros. Dojo as casual updates. Clearly, each character isn't much of a big deal, right? Characters are just so easy to add. There were people at the time who were so clueless as to say, every assist trophy should just be made into a character instead. As if they had no idea how the process of adding characters to the game worked. K. Rool would be somewhat left behind in the chaos that was this shuffle, and his campaign only really got off the ground once Diddy Kong was finally revealed as the 8th newcomer to come to Brawl. Meanwhile, Midnight was at the big trailer at the start, giving a big head start to King Dedede to start his campaign up. The Penguin King would ultimately go on to be the obese, villainous king who made it into the game, with K. Rool again being relegated to a trophy. Of course, with how big the rosters were, the 40 to 50 man roster still often included both K. Rool and Dedede. But this wasn't something that was going to happen for a long, long time. Once Brawl finally came out, people were fairly disappointed with the roster because of how ridiculously high their expectations had become for the game. Back in the day, people would target hatred at Wolf and call him a clone for his specials being superficially similar and having a Landmaster final smash.
We're gonna have fun with this thing.
Despite his regular moveset being entirely different and his specials functioning differently. People actually cared about Final Smashes back then, and they turned his Landmaster into a meme, making pictures of the entire roster replaced by Landmasters. People accused Sakurai of having Star Fox bias at that time, which is hilarious in retrospect considering we would later see what Sakurai truly had bias for. There was a massive 7-year gap between Brawl and the next Smash game, Smash Bros. 4. The speculation cycle for that game was very unique in that after Brawl came out, speculation never really stopped. Speculation for the next title started almost immediately because of how disappointed people were with Brawl, not just for its roster, but for its gameplay. The main reason Melee even has power as a competitive game was because of how terrible Brawl was in that respect, being so anti-competitive as to feature a random chance for characters to trip in the middle of doing any action. It was in this period, immediately after Brawl's release, that K. Rool's momentum really started building. Of the characters who failed to make it into Brawl, Rool was far and away one of the biggest contenders. His popularity would grow and grow over time. He would become a part of a big three alongside his fellow villains Ridley and Mewtwo. Eventually, Mewtwo would be the only member of the trio to get into Smash 4, and there would be constantly rotating third member of the big three, depending on who you asked. Whether it was Banjo, Geno, Crash Bandicoot, or whatever other character the person bringing up the so-called Big Three personally supported. This whole Big Three thing kind of is just leeching off the popularity of Rool and Ridley, as whoever was bringing up the Big Three just trying to associate their character with the two of them. Mewtwo, the original third member of the Big Three, never really had his fate attached to the other two all that much in the first place. He was a cut veteran, so his path to get back into Smash was much easier than the other two. Sakurai had already approved the character, so getting back in was not as big of an ask. Rool's only true ally for his time during speculation was Ridley, and the pair of them would be dubbed various insulting nicknames such as the Never-Evers. Now, aside from Diddy Kong's playable debut, Brawl did have something else that seemed rather important for Donkey Kong's future in Smash. Within Brawl's code, there was data for 7 characters who didn't make it into the final game. Most of these were either veterans who were cut, or characters who had no realistic shot to appear in the future. But one of them was Dixie Kong, suggesting that she was the next character in line for Smash over Rool. Thankfully, Sakurai would later say in an interview that he had planned to include Dixie Kong as a tag team with Diddy Kong, similar to the Ice Climbers, before the idea was ultimately scrapped. Regardless, this didn't stop a considerable amount of people from including Dixie in their roster predictions over Rool. The Kremling King would never be mentioned by Sakurai a single time before he finally made his eventual debut in the game, unlike pretty much every other Smash speculation character who would all get directly addressed at some point. Interviewers would constantly bring up the lack of Ridley, Mewtwo, even some random characters like Crystal from Star Fox, but Sakurai would never be confronted on King Rool, leading to the belief that Sakurai saw him as unimportant. Now, there were many arguments raging back and forth between Rool and Dixie. Dixie Kong has her own game with her name in the title, so clearly, she's the superior choice, right? Well, for the next decade, I would be arguing why I personally considered Rool the superior choice. So starting off, Dixie Kong did not appear in Donkey Kong 64, as she would get replaced by Tiny Kong, who was basically an altered version of the character and a spiritual successor. Regardless of whatever DK64's quality is as a game now, it was a massive game at the time and it is the most visible the series has ever been outside of the country titles. Meanwhile, Rool is the main villain in this game. In the first country game, which was arguably the most important one, Dixie did not exist at all yet, while Rool was the main villain. While less important, the peg-swinging games made by Paon also feature Rool in very prominent main villain roles. Dixie is technically in these games, but only as a minor cameo, getting a brief appearance in the opening cutscene and being one of countless extra characters in the multiplayer mode. If anything, King of Swing would imply that the 4 main characters of the franchise were DK, Diddy, Rool, and Cranky Kong, not Dixie. These are the only 4 DK characters who actually have roles in the story. Obviously, the ancient Donkey Kong cartoon was never used for any serious arguments, but it's worth bringing up that even there, the 3 Donkey Kong characters who made it into Smash in the end are the only ones who appeared in every single episode. Cranky comes in 4th, with 39 out of 40 episode appearances, while Dixie appears in by far the fewest episodes of any of the main cast members. Overall, Rool is consistently more important to the brand than Dixie. After Dixie's starring role in Country 3, she would never appear in another title in a role that wasn't either a remake or a cameo again for 18 years. The next big argument was comparing the moveset potential of what these 2 characters could do. Let's go over the many things that could have potentially been used from each game, starting with DKC1. Rool was surprisingly fast for a big body in the first game, running across the ship at fast speeds. This would later go on to be translated into his beastly dash dance in Smash Bros., although he'd still move rather slowly for balance reasons. He obviously has the iconic crown toss boomerang, which made it into the game. He can rain down cannonballs from the sky, which could potentially have been a move similar to Pikachu's Thunder, where it doesn't literally come from the top blast zone, but from a set distance above himself. Alternatively, the cannonball rain was always a popular candidate for the final Smash. K. Rool's most infamous move during the original fight was his ability to play dead. He would go down after being jumped on, and fake credits would roll, trying to psych the player out into putting down the controller after letting their guard down so he could come back and kill them. This could have potentially been a hilarious animation for a down special counter, and we did end up getting one in K. Rool's Smash interpretation that we got. In DKC 2, we get a massive variety of projectiles from King K. Rool's blunderbuss that could have been used. The blunderbuss that ultimately made it into Smash only really scraped the tip of the iceberg. In his fight, K. Rool will fire a massive variety of projectiles beyond just a standard cannonball. Some of his cannonballs will bounce along the floor like DDD's Gordos do in Smash. K. Rool also levitates some of his cannonballs through the air with gusts of wind from the blunderbuss, moving them in harder to avoid patterns, rather than simply shooting them directly at the player. When the cannonballs land on the ground, many of them will grow spikes out of their sides, turning them into traps which lay on the floor. Of all of K. Rool's unused potential, that's something I really would have liked to have seen make it into Smash. And he's capable of sending out many other things from his blunderbuss, such as clouds of many different varieties. These clouds have several effects. They can stun the Kongs, reverse the controls, or slow them down. Obviously, control reversal is kind of a stupid effect for a fighting game, but the other two would be perfectly usable. The man can also shoot barrels out of his gun, which could potentially have interesting physics rolling along the floor. K. Rool's also a villainous leader of an entire race, so he could easily have minions at his disposal. My personal favorite idea for him to have a minion was to shoot out a barrel, only for it to later be revealed it's a clobber, similar to how Lord Frederick shoots minions out of his own horn. Regardless, minions would occasionally pop up in K. Rool movesets, with one of my favorite ideas being this abandoned K. Rool moveset project, where the guy would take out Boss Dumdrum and summon claptraps out of it. Giving a character invisibility would be a stretch for a fighting game, but with this magic super gun, it is yet another ability K. Rool has somehow. A more practical interpretation of this would be the fact that K. Rool shoots his blunderbuss behind himself to propel himself forwards as it shoots out fire, which could potentially be some kind of rush attack, such as a side special, forward smash, are most likely a dashing attack. It's entirely unnecessary given the fact that enemies in this game just hurt you on contact, but they even put enough love and care into this boss fight that K. Rool can smack you with his gun when you get into melee range, with a special animation they made just for that. This goes to show that he could use the gun as a melee weapon in this moveset. With all that the gun could do, the blunderbuss being relegated to a single special in the end that was a cross between the neutral specials of DDD and Bowser Jr. is somewhat disappointing, but the alternative moves Sakurai pulled out of thin air were definitely pretty satisfying themselves. Regardless, the guy could pretty much have a moveset based almost entirely off of his gun. There's no shortage of ways to go with him. Country 3 primarily contributes the Propeller Pack that was listed as his up special in literally every K. Rool moveset ever made. It was so common that it did actually make it into the game. The Country 3 fight could potentially also give access to these electric barrier traps seen in the fight, as well as another potential final smash by summoning Chaos. DonkeyKong 64 is a bit redundant by giving him a boxing glove boomerang and another source of invisibility even without using his gun, but the boxing glove did actually make it into Smash as his forward smash attack. Having the glove boomerang off his fist during the forward smash attack could have potentially been an interesting addition, but having the reference there at all was still pretty satisfying. The big move from DonkeyKong 64 that he uses all the time is creating green shockwaves by ground pounding the floor. This was the most commonly cited down special for the character when people made movesets for him that didn't end up making it into the game. K. Rool's gut check counter was a unique creation by Sakurai to fill that slot. Keep in mind, I am not complaining about the K. Rool moveset we ended up getting here. I'm just explaining the mentality about what it could have potentially been before it was shown to us when he was added into Smash Ultimate. The main thing Sakurai did take from DonkeyKong 64, of course, and definitely feels like the correct choice, is the Blastomatic Final Smash, where he goes to destroy DK Island in an elaborate cinematic. If you hit the nail on the head with anything, it was definitely that. It was better than I ever imagined it. Just look at how much K. Rool is enjoying himself here, I love it. Now, granted, there's some more potential from the Pan games, even if people didn't want to see it. He technically has access to a giant form, Fire Breath, and a flying barrel vehicle that's a ripoff of Eggman's Egg Pod. He doesn't need these extra moves, though, and he did not use them when he got into Smash. It was incredibly insulting at the time to have some people come to the conclusion that he would just be a generic Bowser clone, because apparently having 2 green reptilian kings is just something unheard of. People would insultingly compare K. Rool to Bowser's appearance in a single random episode of this cartoon where he decided to don a crown and cape, saying that he was a King Koopa copy. TV Tropes even made a category out of this where K. Rool was on the image, which is really insulting. But the K. Rool fanbase spun it in a way that was more positive by quoting the Smash 4 trophy, which said that King K. Rool is to Donkey Kong as Bowser is to Mario, to try and emphasize how important K. Rool was. So, what does Dixie Kong have to answer K. Rool's countless options with? Not much. Her main claim to fame is spinning her hair around like a helicopter and attacking people with that hair of hers. People have tried to extrapolate potential from this with things like having her hair turn into a fist, which she hasn't done before, but most of the time people have to resort to props that aren't strongly associated with her. The most commonly suggested prop is her using her electric guitar to attack. The guitar is only pulled out for 2 seconds as a victory animation, but she's so dull that that's the best she can come up with. Other suggestions include stealing moves from Tiny Kong, since Tiny Kong is a ripoff of her, or just using general props from the game, such as summoning random animal buddies, or even Kiddy Kong. Speaking of Kiddy Kong, remember Dixie's starring role in Donkey Kong Country 3, which is one of her only big selling points? This random commercial decided to instead market Kiddy Kong as the main character.
Donkey Kong Country 3 starring Kiddy Kong.
Aside from his war with Dixie Kong, K. Rool would have many other hurdles to overcome. K. Rool's final appearance, outside of showing up in Smash as trophies, would be in Mario Super Sluggers in 2008. This fact has got this game jokingly referred to as K. Rool Super Sluggers, as this fact is pretty much the only reason this obscure game ever gets brought up in modern conversations. There's the reason K. Rool is one of the only models anybody bothered to rip from the game on Model Resource. Other characters have plentiful models in other games to make use of. The fact Super Sluggers was his best model, where he's wearing some kind of bizarre adult diaper, also meant that there was a much bigger burden for the fans to prove K. Rool's moveset potential with words, because they couldn't just casually point to a hack like other fans could as a demonstration for their character. Ridley and Waluigi came equipped with perfectly usable models directly in Brawl, which would quickly be turned into hacks. But all K. Rool had was his trophy, which wasn't even in T-pose. K. Rool's hacks would struggle to get off the ground, with his most prominent ones being ugly reskins of King Dedede and Bowser. No unique K. Rool moveset hack would ever end up being finished. The K. Rool hack by Paon was the one that got furthest along. Considering he had done other characters like Metal Face, there was hope he'd finish his K. Rool moveset. In hindsight, though, you can see how difficult it was to make the character transition to modern 3D properly. Paon's K. Rool looks like some kind of gargantuan monster who came from an entirely different franchise, and could barely show any kind of expression. Another K. Rool mod, the one with Dumb Drum that I mentioned earlier by MKHT, was considerably better looking, but it never got finished either. This is another completely unique model made from scratch. All the progress you're seeing here was only revealed after K. Rool got into the game officially, and the hack was deemed pointless. So all this beautiful work you see here went unreleased, and wasn't able to be used for argumentative purposes like other mods for characters like Ridley and Waluigi. Even in the 2D Smash fan game realm, K. Rool's sprites weren't doing him any favors either, which would result in him going heavily unused. The country sprites are in a very unique style that is near impossible to make new sprites for, while the sprites from the Pan games were minimalistic with few poses and not exactly being very appealing to look at in the first place. You can see just how awkward it is to use these sprites even in something like Mugen. He certainly wasn't going to make it into an actual good fan game like Smash Crusade. K. Rool's use in general would get considerably toned down after Rare was bought out by Microsoft, with the Donkey Kong property being passed around like a hot potato. Pan is the only company who bothered to make use of K. Rool after Rare left, and the games they released were of questionable quality, to say the least. Many K. Rool defenders will praise Pan for actually using Donkey Kong's extended cast, but I have my own opinions about that. Pan's adventure titles on Game Boy Advance and DS are gimmick games where you can only control DK by using the L and R buttons to swing from peg to peg as he uncontrollably spins around them, which was a radical departure from the classic platforming fans had grown to love. K. Rool's roles in these games are reduced to being a much more cookie-cutter villain. Nobody would be a fan of him based off these much more forgettable boss battles. Even if the gameplay had been good, K. Rool was nothing to write home about in these games. Cranky Kong, meanwhile, was reduced to a generic friendly old grandpa who was not actually cranky at all. Even from a fan service perspective, I'm not a fan of Pan's games. Barrel Blast is the game which features the Kremlings most prominently of any of the DK games ever, and was another poorly reviewed Pan game. This is a racing game where the control system has a waggle gimmick with the Wii remote, and plays about as well as you'd expect. The game has obvious cut corners. Rather than a set amount of tracks, there's a set amount of track pieces that make up the tracks. A portion of tracks are directly reused inside of other tracks, leading to the game feeling very samey, dull, and rushed. The playable roster of this game features an equal amount of Kongs and Kremlings to try to create a theme of them fighting each other. While there are plenty of Kremlings they could have used but didn't, such as Klubba or Chaos, they chose to make 4 new Kremlings to fill up the roster. I don't exactly have a lot of nice things to say about them, but it is fine if you like them, so take what I say with a grain of salt. Kludge is just an unnecessary replacement for Krusha, but the other 3 are highlights. 2 of them are kid Kremlings, and 2 of them are girls, trying to bring some diversity to the Kremling roster. Calypso is a big favorite for certain kinds of people who don't need to be brought up here, and she single-handedly caused some girl Kremling original characters to start popping up. They also redesigned Tiny Kong to no longer be tiny. General Clump has gone from being a soldier in the military, some kind of dumb hobo who wears a bucket on his head. Outside of these original characters, Rool is surrounded by a bunch of generic enemies making up the Kremling roster, and it's really not a group he wants to be associated with here. This arbitrary Kremling vs. Kong theme blocked characters like Chunky Kong from being playable, but that's beside the point. This game was the most prominent appearance of the Kremlings before they never appeared again for a good 11 years until Rool's appearance in Smash Ultimate. It's really not a good look for them. Pan seems to have damaged the brand of the Kremlings with these games, and I'm not the only one who thinks this, considering what a strong anti-Kremling hatred came from certain individuals during the time. Seriously, there's no shortage of people who hate Rool because they consider him ugly. This was used as a legitimate counterpoint that he's ugly. Look at Rool, he's so ugly. We could never put him in Smash. After the Pan games, Rool would go into a decade-long slumber until his eventual appearance in Smash Ultimate. The thing is that after Brawl, Rool's speculation scene at first looked stronger, because his most recent appearance in Mario Super Sluggers wasn't quite so long ago. But as more time passed, things would look worse and worse for Rool. In 2010, we would eventually get the first good Donkey Kong game since Rare left the company with Donkey Kong Country Returns, which was yet another game to not feature Rool or the Kremlings. What made Rool's absence from this game in particular sting, though, was that the developers directly commented on Rool and the Kremlings. Enter Kensuke Tanabe, Rool's ultimate rival. Even Dixie Kong pales in comparison.
Together, like, well, what are we going to do about King Rool? Is he coming back? And we thought about it, and we said, well, does he really need to? Why don't we just come up with something completely new?
Tanabe's philosophy was from the school of game design. Every enemy had to be made with very strict signifiers in mind. According to Tanabe, the Kremlings looked too much like cartoons without any game design thought process behind them. So he designed some tikis with flat heads that were more inviting to be jumped on by players, along with a satisfying bongo noise when their heads were burst open by Donkey Kong crushing them underneath his girth. I'm not going to go into the tikis in too much detail here to avoid repeating myself, but for the full rundown on those guys, be sure to check out my other video where I rank every mainline Donkey Kong boss. While some people at the time incorrectly blamed Miyamoto for the removal of the Kremlings, he didn't seem to have anything against them, and he's outright a fan of Cranky Kong, as his request is the only reason that Cranky appears in Donkey Kong Returns at all. Miyamoto also seems to directly approve of Cranky Kong's appearance in the Mario movie, so he's definitely very fond of the character. There was an old interview parroted everywhere where it was claimed where Miyamoto supposedly said that Donkey Kong Country proves that gamers will put up with bad gameplay so long as the graphics are good. But this was eventually proven false, as the supposed source for this infamous quote does not actually exist. Rool would go for so long without appearing in a real DK game that some people would start to incorrectly assume that Microsoft owned the Kremlings, which was yet another obnoxious point the fans would have to disprove time and time again. While this was easy to prove as factually false, as Nintendo ended up owning everything related to DK after the departure of Rare, and clearly used the character plenty of more times after their departure anyway, so many people kept incorrectly assuming that it was still something of a hurdle for the amount of people who would just count him out based on this stupid assumption. It's an easy enough thing to think, to be fair. Even Microsoft executives were clueless enough to think that they owned Donkey Kong with the purchase of Rare at first, but they would later be proven wrong, obviously. Eventually, Retro would go on to release their second Donkey Kong title. They addressed the vast majority of fan criticisms of the first game with it. Water levels returned. David Wise, the original composer from the Donkey Kong games during the Rare days, would be brought back to compose some music for the game. More classic characters would be brought back into the game to please the fans. Most prominently, Dixie Kong, Rool's longtime speculation rival, would finally be brought back from the dead. As far as the villains, the employees at Retro did as best as they could to listen to the criticisms from fans that the Tikis were generic non-characters, as they did their best to give the villains and bosses more personality, as opposed to being literal planks of wood. Unfortunately for the Kremlings, they were not brought back directly, but a new villainous group known as the Snowmads replaced them. Again, I go over Lord Frederick, their leader, in a lot more detail in my other video, so if you want the full story, be sure to check that one out. Regardless, the point is that Dixie Kong had managed to get past the iron fist of Kensuke Tanabe, while Rool was still in purgatory. Despite the fact that Dixie Kong had an 18-year gap between Donkey Kong Country 3 and Tropical Freeze, where the only roles in between were remakes and cameos, plenty of people flocked to her as their preferred pick, because she was new, relevant, and marketable. As far as her moveset in a potential Smash title, the one thing Dixie managed to pick up was a bubblegum gun from this game, and it helped make her resume slightly less underqualified, but it still paled in comparison to the game. Frederick was only jokingly entertained as a potential new character, as it was obvious that Dixie was the primary breakout star of the game as far as a Smash Bros. Candidate, given she did have some previous history to back her up. However, another candidate would enter the ring, muddling the waters for the third Donkey Kong character further. Cranky Kong would be playable for the first time in Tropical Freeze, making him look like a much more appealing candidate. Cranky is generally a beloved character, and he has a better resume than Rool and Dixie as far as appearances. Cranky manages to have a role in nearly every single Donkey Kong title aside from Jungle Beat, and his Scrooge McDuck cane pogo, plus his potions that he uses in Donkey Kong 64, and the fact that he is technically the original arcade DK, give him a lot of potential for an interesting moveset. Unfortunately for Cranky, he was too late to the party to pick up any serious momentum, however, even if he was a brief distraction. The main thing you need to know about speculation is that fan bases take a long time to build, and the strongest were all founded either during Brawl or shortly after it ended in the 7-year lead up to Smash 4. Many choices were more acceptable back then. Again, if you need proof, look no further than Geno over there. The game that made Cranky show up as a blip on the radar hadn't come out until a few months before Smash Bros. 4 finally released. The only other characters who manage to get fan bases are ones who are already deemed as likely, so people hop on the bandwagon. You see, in Smash Bros. Speculation, there's a very simple feedback loop. If a character is likely to be in Smash, they automatically become more popular by default. They become more popular, they are seen as more likely to get into the game. This loop goes up exponentially. So the earlier on in the game you're either deemed as likely or popular, the more time this feedback loop has to build. Most obvious case is for characters who ended up getting leaked to be in the game, with so-called fan bases for these characters springing up overnight. Of course, this also applies to the leaks that ended up being fake, so now there's a small handful of people who demand that the chorus kids from Rhythm Heaven should be in the game, despite that being a character nobody ever actively suggested themselves. And for the record, no, I'm not saying Rhythm Heaven is a character nobody wants, but Chorus Kids were never the fan choice. It was always the wrestler or Karate Joe or the reporter or something. So, Dixie Kong was the new, relevant game, but K. Rool wasn't, with only a few months before the new game was going to come out. Was K. Rool dead in the water? Not quite yet, because there's something about the production cycle of Smash that the casual fan doesn't often realize, called the project plan. Sakurai doesn't just haphazardly add characters one by one as he's making his video game. The roster is decided at the start of the production cycle, and these games take years to make. So, in essence, if you want to get into the game because you're new and relevant, you need to be new, but not too new. It's the reasoning why, for example, despite Melee releasing after the 3rd generation of Pokemon, only 2nd generation Pokemon and older were in the game. Tropical Freeze got no references whatsoever in Smash 4, and that was something K. Rool was very thankful for. Eventually, as the game got closer, a new single-player mode was revealed for the game called Smash Run, and there were critter Kremlings in this mode as generic enemies, which was a massive win for the K. Rool fans. People thought the presence of these guys meant K. Rool would have to make it in, right? The Tikis were still there too, but if anything, Kremlings and Tikis being together felt like a good omen, like it was acceptable for these two enemy factions to coexist with one another. Infamous content creator, Egoraptor, supposedly played one of the Smash demos where he had access to Smash Run, and claimed there was a large Kremling present that he fought during it. When asked if it was K. Rool, he said he wasn't a DK fan and couldn't identify it or remember. Gee, thanks for the help, Egoraptor. I don't know how it's even possible to know what Kremlings are called without being able to identify K. Rool, but he somehow managed to do it. Another rumor was that Cranky Kong was supposedly in as an assist trophy in the demo, but of course the man provided no evidence. Chunky being in would be good news for K. Rool, as he was another rare character who hadn't been seen in ages. Anything from rare was seen as a win for K. Rool, since all of the rare stuff was old and irrelevant like he was, while anything new and shiny from the Retro Studios games was deemed as good for Dixie Kong. Supposedly, when Chunky appeared from the assist trophy, he would do a ground pound and cause bananas to rain down from the ceiling, like in his portion of the DK rap. People would go to the demos with their cameras ready to try to capture the elusive Cranky Kong on film, but unfortunately, Cranky Kong was never found and it was deemed as a hoax. So remember when I brought up that thing where leaks would be deemed as making likely characters more popular? Well, the vast majority of the game's roster would get leaked by someone called Salamano. Putting it nicely, it wasn't something that looked appealing to K. Rool fans. No DK characters in sight, no villains anywhere, all new and relevant characters from the latest games intended to advertise them and make Nintendo as much money as possible. Eventually, one of the characters in the leak would get disproven, Chrom from Fire Emblem, but he was just replaced with a different Fire Emblem character. With how highly specific the rest of the leak was, it seemed a very likely conclusion that Chrom was just changed out for Robin, since Chrom did feature prominently in Robin's trailer for the game. One of the last additions to the game was Bowser Jr. That was our big villain character our demographic was supposed to get hyped over. I mean, I don't want to insult that character too much as he is a rather unjustified target of hatred, and the fact he has the 7 Koopalings as an alternate costume makes him considerably cooler than he would be otherwise. But for us Kremling people, it was a big letdown. As far as the villain count went, we technically didn't even have a net gain in villains because Wolf had been cut from the game. Yeah, remember when people accused Sakurai of having Star Fox bias? Hilarious in hindsight. The only other villainous character was Dark Pit, who was an almost identical clone of Pit and more of a slap in the face than anything. Kid Icarus, a series with 3 games that Sakurai had personally worked on, now had more characters than DonkeyKong. Yeah, Dark Pit was a lazy clone, who didn't take up much development time, but at this point DK fans were starving for another character. Funky Kong or something would have been enough to just throw us a bone. Villains became a big recurring trend for K. Rool's appeal to get in, even though there were not exactly a whole lot of them who were qualified to get into Smash beyond K. Rool and Ridley. This was the most common ground these two characters would share, that and being gigantic heavyweights. Aside from simply wanting to play as these legendary Nintendo villains, there was a practical gameplay reason now as to why people wanted to play as these characters. In the entirety of Smash 4's newcomers, The heaviest one had ended up being the scrawny Bowser Jr., who was only as heavy as Samus. It was a seriously underrepresented playstyle. If you're not the type of person to play heavyweights, just imagine how dull it would be if a new Smash game came out, and there were no new mains for you among the new characters, and you were stuck playing as returning veterans for the majority of your gameplay. You can see how that would have a major impact on your game from an enjoyment perspective. That was my personal experience, and I largely had to settle for the reworked Bowser when I played Smash 4. The fact that Donkey Kong had been so utterly ignored as the character roster size ballooned up during Smash 4 was definitely a blessing in disguise for K. Rool, though. If a generic Funky Kong clone had got in, or God forbid, Dixie had somehow appeared, support for K. Rool would have dried up as he would have been seen as impossible. For everything going against him, that precious third Donkey Kong character slot was just so blatantly missing. It was a gigantic, villainous, crocodile-shaped hole in the roster. It managed to keep the fire going when so many people constantly told K. Rool to throw in the towel. There was a large degree of resentment from some people towards Smash 4's roster when it initially came out, but K. Rool's story was far from over. Eventually, about half a year after Smash 4 had come out, the Smash Ballot opened up.
And that is my vision for a better Congo Bongo. Good day, ladies, and I hope I can count on your help.
Oh, he's much more charming and intelligent than I ever imagined.
And way less slimy, too.
Good day, sir.
The ballot had been Iwata's idea, and it was one of his greatest gifts that the man managed to give us before his passing. Smash Ballot was a poll where people could suggest characters to be in Smash to Sakurai directly, with the idea that the data used from this poll would influence the picks for future DLC characters to make it into the game. Ballot is pretty much the only thing justifying the existence of all of Smash speculation, as this was the one and only time where fan opinions have directly mattered to the series. The ballot ran from April 2015 to October. Everything leading up to this exact moment was pivotal for who people were ultimately going to vote for. There's only a small handful of character slots that were going to be decided by fan demand by the end of it, and everybody wanted to claim those roster spots for themselves. Anything where fans were loud after the ballot ended? Completely pointless. The cries would fall on deaf ears and would never reach Nintendo. Any new characters who showed up in games after October 2015, they would have to rely exclusively on relevance, since popularity would not get them anywhere. This ballot is ultimately what managed to get K. Rool into the game. Without it, he would have faded into obscurity. The K. Rool fans were perfectly mobilized at the time of the game's release, and had plenty of motivation after Smash 4's roster had nothing but table scraps for Donkey Kong fans. While this 6-month period might not sound like a long time for characters to start up a proper campaign to get into Smash Bros., in reality, the vast majority of legitimate votes would be cast in the first few days the poll was up. Even ignoring that, starting up a campaign is something that takes years to build, and K. Rool was a titan who had been building his campaign ever since Diddy Kong's reveal to be in Brawl 8 years ago. There was other good news for K. Rool as well, in that a considerable amount of this competition would be eliminated, or at the very least, heavily crippled. On the Japanese version of the ballot, it would be said that the ballot was going to be used for future Smash titles, but that notice wasn't there on the English ballot. This meant that everybody took it as a ballot to get into Smash 4 specifically, so characters that already had non-playable roles in Smash 4 would have their vote counts heavily damaged. Sakurai would have gone on the record as saying Ridley was impossible due to his large size, and he was already in Smash 4 as a stage hazard. Plenty of the die-hard fans obviously voted for Ridley anyway, but if polls are any indication of ballot performance, he would score significantly lower in polls after this than he had previously. Ridley would be put in as a joke option, since not only was he a stage hazard, Sakurai had expressly stated his refusal to put in Ridley at this point multiple times, insisting that he was impossible. Thankfully, Ridley had managed to pop up on Sakurai's radar without the ballot already, and he would go on to later change his mind, but that's besides the point. What's relevant here is the fact that a decent amount of people who might have voted for Ridley ended up voting for K. Rool. The other popular character who would get slaughtered by the ballot was Waluigi, due to the fact he was an assist trophy at the time, and thus deconfirmed. Voting for deconfirmed characters was seen as throwing your vote into the trash can. The road was largely paved with gold for K. Rool to go forward and capitalize on the ballot. The most egregiously and mysteriously missing character during the ballot was Geno, because his fan base had seemed to fall dormant during the ballot era due to a lack of any news on that dead character, giving nothing to stimulate his fan base into action. Arguably, K. Rool's biggest competition for the ballot would come from another character made by Rare, Banjo-Kazooie. Banjo and Kazooie would be a rather alarming character to be popular on the ballot for K. Rool, because they appealed to the same demographic, Rare fans, and they would cause the vote to get split between the two of them. John Tron would even endorse Banjo and tell his YouTube subscribers to go vote for him in the ballot. Of course, he did not throw any such bone to K. Rool, though. In the end, both halves of the Game Grumps kind of got their chance to take a dump on the Kremling King. This was before John Tron got cancelled for getting into politics, so people actually cared what he said back then. People would be hunting down endorsements from people, such as the creators of the characters, to try to get them to endorse their characters like some kind of silly slap fight. But Steve Mayles ultimately did the sensible thing and just endorsed all of them. Banjo is definitely not a character K. Rool had seen coming as a potential obstacle, as the bear had been considered impossible due to being owned by Microsoft. Banjo would have to compete with Steve from Minecraft because they were owned by the same company. And considering how Minecraft is 1,000 times more successful than Banjo-Kazooie, the character addition seemed to make sense at the time. For the ballot, though, likelihood didn't directly matter. These were precious votes going to Banjo that could have easily gone to K. Rool instead. And Banjo seemed so unlikely that it felt like people were throwing their votes into the fire where they easily could have been put to good use on the King's behalf instead. Nobody ever thought that the Rare fans would be numerous enough to get not only one, but two characters into the game. Banjo had a shockingly large fan base that had just laid dormant up until now, and it had just needed something like this to spring it into action. Even though Banjo is not technically from DonkeyKong, Sakurai clearly considers them as from the same franchise, given their eventual trailers would treat Donkey Kong and Banjo as one series. Banjo had technically made his debut in Diddy Kong Racing after all, before getting his own game. Dixie Kong was technically still around too, though she seemed considerably less popular than the other two Rare characters now that people actually had a choice on who they were able to vote for, rather than just going with her because she was the most relevant. Now that the game was in DLC season, Tropical Freeze was no longer too new for the project plan, and was fair game to get in off of being new and relevant. But the Donkey Kong franchise would never end up getting a character on its own. It was up to the fans to make that happen. The ballot would rage on for a considerable time, and things were looking relatively good for K. Rool for a while. So good that K. Rool was announced to be in the game! As a Mii costume. Yeah, that's right, a Mii costume. Mii costumes had become the newest way of deconfirming characters. They were supposed to be consolation prizes for fighters who didn't make the game as playable, but they were primarily seen as a target of ridicule. Mii fighter costumes would go on to be called deconfirmation waves, as that was largely all they were seen as for the most part. The fact this costume had been revealed before the ballot was even over was a major hit to morale, and votes for him would definitely decrease to some extent. Thankfully, the ballot had already been going for a few months already, where the bulk of the votes had already been cast, but it was still a blow. The main thing that kept us going was the fact that there were already Mii costumes for characters that were already playable in the base game, such as Meta Knight. So this didn't necessarily mean that he was dead 100%, but it certainly made it look far more unlikely. It just wouldn't make sense to show this random, hideous Mii costume before revealing K. Rool to be playable in the same game. Keep in mind, K. Rool had never really been mentioned in a Smash context before, so addressing him at all was a big deal. At the same time, K. Rool was too old and irrelevant to get this Mii costume just at total random, especially when the Mii looks so ugly and out of place in this random costume. It looks like K. Rool was some kind of taxidermy sculpture being worn by the Mii as a hat. The sad state of the fact was that K. Rool just didn't seem all that likely anymore, but we kept voting and campaigning anyway. We were already invested into our character, and there's no point in jumping ship now over halfway through the ballot. The other big speculation character that ended up being forcibly turned into a Mii costume was Geno, and K. Rool would start getting acquainted to Geno as an old, relevant character who just had an artificial popularity from a vocal minority. This was infuriating to K. Rool, as Geno was a side character from a single game made in 1996, with nothing but a single cameo since then, and he was owned by Square Enix to boot. K. Rool, meanwhile, was the main villain of one of Nintendo's most prominent franchises. But just because of the fact he hadn't appeared in any games recently, that didn't matter apparently. He was equal to a character who had been picked out of a hat at random during Brawl speculation in the eyes of many ongoers, and this Mii costume associating him with a character as lowly as Geno was terrifying for him. Now, K. Rool's appearances in all of these old games didn't technically matter for him getting into Smash in the end, as Sakurai continued to ignore the DK franchise, but enabled him to garner more legitimate popularity than Geno's by fans coming in from his series, rather than joining a movement for Smash just for the sake of it. Cloud would eventually get shown and be revealed as the character who got the most votes from the Final Fantasy series, which pretty much meant nothing and was not exactly something that worried people. But it showed that the ballot at least mattered in some capacity. What really caused Smash speculation, and the K. Rool fanbase specifically, to spontaneously explode were the final two characters revealed. On top of a game already filled with advertisements and already drowning in Fire Emblem characters, you would get Corrin, a direct Fire Emblem advertisement character, from a game that had not even been released outside of Japan yet. That was bad enough, but the ballot winner would be revealed to be Bayonetta, a character who is virtually unknown in the Smash speculation scene, causing everyone else's minds to be blown as well. Bayonetta did come with a couple of asterisks as the supposed ballot winner, however. First off, she wasn't really the ballot winner. She was the ballot winner among realizable characters, which could mean anything, even characters on the ballot Sakurai personally liked or something. Of course, this would lead to a massive amount of gaslighting, as everyone would call people asking for K. Rool and other snubbed characters crazy. All of the characters in Smash speculation were just seen as a vocal minority, and that they were apparently thousands of people outside of our bubble who had managed to vote Bayonetta into the game. The fact Bayonetta had only one among realizable characters was hand-waved as people saying that some joke characters like Shrek or Goku had won the ballot. If you can believe it, this was not a meme, but a legitimate argument people used for over 5 years after Bayonetta got in, insisting that Shrek was the secret winner of the ballot. I obviously don't need to tell you how ridiculous that is. People who threw their votes away on stupid characters like Shrek or SpongeBob are not exactly mobilized into a movement, and would split their votes on whatever hot new joke character of the day came their way. One of the other arguments that was used was that the ballot was merely a suggestion box, and that Sakurai was under no obligation to add characters from it. It was very easy for fans of popular characters like K. Rool to give in to all of this gaslighting, and accept this mainstream narrative. But there was one smoking gun for us crazy irrelevant Crocodile fans who insisted that Bayonetta and Shrek had not won the ballot. A data mine of the Smash patches would eventually reveal that the downloadable character slots had already been placed into the game just 2 weeks into the ballot, long before it ended, suggesting that Bayonetta's standing in the ballot was rigged. To clarify, this isn't literally a character slot that said Bayonetta, but extra dummy slots were added into the game in this patch at the end of DLC. At the same time, despite the fact this dummy slot doesn't loudly say Bayonetta on it, dummy character slots are based on characters who are most similar to the character who is eventually going to take that slot. So, can you guess what Bayonetta's slot was based on? Zero Suit Samus. To clarify, the people defending this weren't even saying the slot wasn't Bayonetta. The resounding notion was that it was in fact her. They just accepted that. However, the people who did defend it would say that he only took the votes from the first 2 weeks and made a decision based off of that, and that all the votes after those first 2 weeks in the ballot period that went on for many months were just counterfeit duplicate votes anyway. If you know anything whatsoever about game development, 2 weeks is not an amount of time to just casually decide a character roster on. There are countless technical problems that can come up, and how Sakurai's project plans have worked in the past are direct evidence of that. These are characters the team are going to be working on for a long time to come, and and can't just casually all be decided at once like it's nothing. Regardless, the resounding narrative was that Rool fans were crazed 30-year-old nerds living in their mother's basement, and that only new and relevant characters would get into Smash Bros. From now on. Rool fans would be completely and utterly defeated by Smash 4. It had been 7 years between Melee and Brawl, and 7 years between Brawl and Smash 4. Nobody expected a new game to show up, and all of the defeated characters would end up going their separate ways. However, the console that Smash 4 was released on was the Wii U, which was one of Nintendo's biggest flops ever. They were forced to release a new console, the Nintendo Switch, and with it, a new Smash game had to be on its way sooner than later. Rool fans felt like they had been dragged through the mud after having been so relentlessly mocked, and weren't ready to be let down by Smash again. Rool would be getting compared to Wart from Super Mario Bros. 2 to exaggerate how irrelevant he was and insist that he was some forgotten villain character who nobody liked. The first reveal of Smash Ultimate wasn't exactly promising for the Rool demographic, as the only new character shown was Inkling, another new and relevant Nintendo IP. Obviously, nobody was denying that Inkling should get into the game, but Sakurai outright came and said to not expect many newcomers, so people were expecting more of the same from Smash Ultimate. This game was just going to be Smash 4 with a small handful of character additions, that ported off the dying console that was the Wii U, right? That's what we assumed. People predicted pessimistic rosters full of nothing but the latest advertisements, but we still held out hope for Rool, and that the ballot had in fact mattered. Now that it was a new game, Rool was no longer eliminated by that putrid Mii costume anymore. If anything, the costume was a direct acknowledgement from Sakurai that implied he had heard us on the ballot in some way. We just had to hope that wasn't the end of it. All the while during this time, Nintendo would still be pretending that the Kremlings didn't exist. The official Nintendo Treehouse Twitter announced they would be doing a DonkeyKong podcast, and they asked in the tweet what characters they wanted to have talked about. Of course, all of the Rool fans quickly yelled in the tweets for them to talk about the Kremlings. When the podcast started, the host of the program did his best to avoid mentioning any of the rare games or the Kremlings at all costs. He outright said that his favorite Donkey Kong game was Punch-Out Wii.
But my all-time, and I know this isn't a DK game, but it's Punch-Out for Wii.
Yeah, I remember that was quite a cool surprise in that game. I don't remember if I ever got to him, because from what I remember it was really tough to do that, but I saw like a screenshot or something and lost my mind. Because
clearly that counts as a Donkey Kong game. I love Punch-Out Wii, but claiming that is your favorite DK game is like saying your favorite Batman character is Superman. It would take until halfway through the podcast before Samantha Robertson finally said that they should give a shout out to the Kremlings, but she was hastily cut off by her male co-host.
I feel like we gotta throw a little bit of love out to the Kremlings too, because they...
yeah, absolutely, those guys.
It's like the man is under some kind of NDA to avoid mentioning them with how much he refuses to talk about them. Unless he just really hates them that much for some inexplicable reason. Rool's campaign headquarters was primarily located within Smashboards, and the character thread for Rool was titled Rool's Kremling Cutthroats. This was a title for the Kremlings directly brought up within Donkey Kong Country 2, so it's not like this was fabricated out of nothing. One particularly smarmy Reset Era user decided to turn this into a controversy though, by saying that the thread title had 3 Ks in it. Yes, it was true there were 3 Ks, but they weren't in a row. Rool's Kremling Cutthroats abbreviates to KRKK, not the infamous bedsheet-wearing group. Regardless, this was used as propaganda by people who weren't actually offended, but wanted to fabricate a controversy to try to drag the Kremling fans down. Due to the failure of the Wii U, Tropical Freeze would get ported to Switch off of the dying console. This wasn't just a straight port, but contained a few new features. Most notably, Funky Kong had been promoted to a playable character, and because him being playable was the primary difference with the game, he was very heavily advertised, much more directly than Dixie had been. New Funky Mode was the gimmick to sell the game, plastered directly over the game's cover. New Funky Mode would briefly become something of a meme, similar to that one meme where people would attach "Add Knuckles" to the ending of random game titles to mock the title of Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Regardless, the point of this whole thing is that Funky Kong was considered as another candidate for the coveted third Donkey Kong character slot, and he even filled the niche Rool did of being a heavyweight to boot. Eventually, the big trailer that would set the tone for the game would be revealed. Sakurai would go on to show that every cut veteran from the series would return in this installment. All of them, even characters like young Link and Pichu, due to how common it was for veterans to be requested. What's more, K. Rool's one lifelong ally in all of this, Ridley. Fans were ecstatic, and the K. Rool fans were no exception, as the majority of them had also been supporters of Ridley as the other big heavyweight reptile villain. It was clear that Sakurai was doing his best to please the fans, despite having previously said Ridley was impossible. He forced himself to find a way to make the character work after fans were so insistent on seeing him make it in. While a small handful of people would think that Ridley getting in meant that K. Rool was done for because of them fulfilling similar demographics, the overwhelming majority did not see it that way. The two reptiles were two sides of the same coin. Sakurai was going out of his way to appeal to fan service. It just seems far more likely than not that K. Rool would make it in as one of the most popular characters on the ballot. After K. Rool fans had been so consistently mocked, the king and his people had gained a massive surge in confidence towards getting into the game. An interview around this time would help to reveal Sakurai's mentality, and gave some insight as to why he wanted to make Smash Ultimate to directly appeal to the fans. After Smash 4, Sakurai had received extensive criticism over his roster decisions, to the point some of it had somehow apparently reached him directly. Sakurai outright compared himself to George Lucas, thinking himself as a visionary who had lost the favor of the people, and that wasn't something he wanted to happen to him. He brings up the massive hatred of Dark Pit in this interview, insisting that Dark Pit is supposed to be a dessert after the main meal. The fans hated Dark Pit so much that they preferred to have him not be there at all, despite how little effort he took to make. Him being in the game was just that offensive to fans at the time. Sakurai responded to this criticism by making the new Echo system in Smash Ultimate. Characters who were super direct clones of other characters were deemed as Echoes. Now, the big issue here that shows how aware Sakurai was of the hatred of Dark Pit was that he included an option to outright hide Echoes from the character selection menu. This isn't something a normal developer would do, outright giving an option to just delete characters from the menu selection screen. At the same time, Sakurai knew he couldn't just cut these characters given how many requests there were for cut veterans, no matter how relevant they were. So he tried to do his best to satisfy everyone with this change. Sakurai was really doing his best to look out for the fans, and didn't want to make another massive blunder happen like with Dark Pit. Following the release of the Everyone Is Here trailer, where every veteran was confirmed to return, an unexpected character would spontaneously gain a massive boost in momentum: Waluigi. Memes implying that Waluigi was the one character missing from Everyone Who Is Here would begin circulating, and gain a massive amount of traction. The primary reason why Waluigi specifically would blow up at this point was because Daisy, his rival who nobody thought was going to get in, would be confirmed as an Echo. And at the exact same time, Waluigi would be shown to be an assist trophy. Seeing Waluigi's rival get to so directly insult him angered the Waluigi fans, and created what appeared to be a brief threat. Waluigi would somehow become so popular during this period that Reggie from Nintendo of America would take notice, and said that he would make Mr. Sakurai aware of the demand for Waluigi. Reggie would later go on to retire from Nintendo, and with it, the only foothold Waluigi had ever gained. Waluigi had already been deconfirmed as an assist trophy for Smash Ultimate, so advocating for him was always doomed to failure. In particular, Waluigi's assist trophy status during Smash 4 meant almost nobody voted for him in the ballot, dooming him to miss out on Smash Ultimate. This would also be the big moment where the movement for Geno would start to truly take off, and he would become a gigantic character. While Geno's fans had largely been dormant during the ballot, Sakurai offhandedly mentioned that he'd like to include Geno in the game, which somehow caused the Geno fanbase to explode and gain a multitude of followers and grow exponentially. Even with the ballot, Sakurai had still never directly mentioned K. Rool by name, so it was really frustrating for the K. Rool people. With what we know now, it's clear that Sakurai would not just randomly name-drop a character as a good potential addition before adding them, as that would spoil the surprise. But that's not what people thought at the time, as they just took Sakurai's mention of Geno literally and bandwagoned massive amounts of support onto the character. Unfortunately for Geno, it was too late for him, At the very least for Smash Ultimate. If you want to know how I know for a fact that Geno was dead during Smash 4, Geno's headquarters is Smashboards, and his thread barely had any posts in it compared to the other ones during Ballot time. It was only his Smash Ultimate thread that exploded, you know, when the Ballot was long since over. Despite these other threats gaining in power level around him, Krool was far and away the favorite to make it in. One last obstacle would rear its ugly head, though. Verkaben had managed to successfully leak several things about Smash Ultimate, and his source would later go on to tell him that Krool was not going to be in the game. Verkaben would successfully predict the majority of Smash Ultimate's roster outside of this one mistake, so it definitely goes to show just how extensively they went out of their way to keep the king a secret. Very shortly before the final day, August 8th, 2018, a Castlevania track would get leaked, confirming that Simon Belmont would be getting in. People resigned themselves to thinking that he would be the big reveal for the Direct and that no other newcomers would appear. When the Direct started, sure enough, Simon Belmont was gotten out of the way and confirmed to be in the game as everyone knew he would be. Eventually, new items and assist trophies from the DonkeyKong series would get teased. This tense moment would be milked for a few seconds as the music stops, making all the Krool fans hold their breath before heaving a collective sigh of relief as it was revealed to not be a deconfirmation for the king. At the end of this Direct, we finally got our moment. The Direct would appear to end, but suddenly there would be earth-shaking in Sakurai's office. In the description slot of every single ballot that the Krool fans filled out, they would be sure to mention the lack of heavyweights, and Sakurai heard that abundantly loud and clear. This was the first big sign as to who it could be. Then the trailer would officially start by showing a montage of villains who had already made it into the game, suggesting there was one missing. Immediately after that, we got a shot of DK's mouth, and if it wasn't obvious yet, the Krool fans would immediately know it was our beloved king from that. After everything we'd been through on the journey to make it here, we had done it. Our dream had finally become a reality. The whole bit with DDD dressing up as K-Rool can also be seen as something of a joke about the K-Rool Mii costume during Smash 4 as well, if you want to read into it. It was clear that Sakurai had seen our ballots, and he would later go on to say that K-Rool received a ton of votes. People weren't actually sure if the helicopter pack would make it into his moveset, but the Smash ballot entry would have fans fill in their own moveset suggestions, and literally every K-Rool moveset would suggest that the helicopter pack should be his recovery. There was really no mistaking it. K-Rool had never really been associated with being fat before, that was just some passive character trait of his, but Sakurai had made that the focal point of his moveset because of all the ballot entries complaining about the lack of heavyweight characters in the game. I've also personally theorized that Incineroar was chosen over Decidueye just for the sake of adding another heavyweight to the game's roster. Incineroar, K-Rool, and Ridley all share the same basic down smash concept where they body slam the ground, after all. Sakurai would later go on to even apologize for saying that he couldn't make K-Rool bigger, showing he was clearly aware of this part of the character's appeal. K-Rool's design, which had been updated since the Pan edition, had managed to receive a major overhaul. Reworking K-Rool's design into the modern age is something that's seriously hard to do, and the hacks that tried to make a model for him certainly proved that. Up until now, the best K-Rool redesigns by fans had been few and far between, such as the Smashified version, and they were just individual pieces of art, not real 3D models. The original K-Rool design by Rare isn't perfect, as it's pretty much just a box with limbs awkwardly sticking out of it. Most notably, the poor guy doesn't even have legs, just two little baby feet. The Pan version fixed this by giving him, God forbid, actual legs, but a lot of distaste was directed towards the Pan design because it was from the mediocre Pan games. Most notably, people didn't like the head of the Pan design, but Sakurai's redesign of K-Rool managed to combine the best of both worlds together. While the Pan version was the base, Sakurai brought back K-Rool's golden chest plate instead of his bland yellow belly, and made a point of it by making it breakable armor. Functioned as super armor that would break after it took a certain amount of damage, and worked as an amazing gimmick that in all of the hundreds of K-Rool sets that have been made had never been thought up by anyone before. K. Rool would also get back his crocodile scales and head from the rare design, creating the true perfect union between them. For how much we loved K. Rool, we really had no idea how he was going to actually look at the end of the day, and Sakurai managed to do an absolutely fantastic job of modernizing him in Smash Ultimate. Many others would attempt to cash in on K. Rool's success after this, but the king for the most part would be the end of the ballot entries to get into the game. K. Rool fans would join the Ridley fans in retirement after speculation, but the last character they would hop onto supporting would be Banjo-Kazooie. It would take until DLC for K. Rool's fellow rare character, Banjo, get confirmed as a newcomer to the game. Now that the Kremling King was finally in, there's no need to be divided on these characters any longer, and K. Rool could reunite with Banjo like a long-lost old friend. In Banjo's trailer, K. Rool outright substitutes for Grunty, the villain of that series. Remember that giant crocodile-shaped hole in the roster I brought up earlier? Yeah, K. Rool filled that in the most direct way imaginable. Thanks for hearing me out. I know that was a lot to take in. If you like this kind of content and want to see more of it, be sure to like, subscribe, and let me know. If there's any mistake I made in the video, or any recollection of events you find inaccurate, be sure to let me know in the comments. If you were a K. Rool supporter during this time, I would love to hear some of your own experience as well, and how you reacted to certain character reveals and events along the way. Don't let your story be forgotten.